The Kissel boys were born and raised in what we used to think of as the quintessential American family, like something that you would watch on some wholesome sitcom from way back when. The boys were as competitive as they were ambitious, and those qualities would take both brothers on their very own unique, successful journeys in life. But the younger of the two, Robert, he always seemed to have a bit of an edge on older brother Andrew. He was taller, he was more athletic, he was more popular, he was more social, he was friendlier. Those things just all came so much easier to him. Robert was the brother who followed the rules. He was by the book. He maneuvered wisely, cautiously, thoughtfully. Andrew, on the other hand, preferred the quick and easy, the fast way to winning, even if it wasn't exactly above board. It didn't matter because getting to the finish line first was the only thing that mattered to Andrew. The irony is the manner in which both of these brothers would come to meet an equally tragic end. 3 years and thousands of miles apart in ways and for reasons that to this day remain mysterious and nearly impossible to reconcile. In this very special vacation series presentation of Killafornia Dreaming, the tale of the Kissel Family Curse. First and foremost, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding, and really your generosity in reaching out over the last few weeks while I struggled through some of my own personal turmoil. I'm not completely past it, but I'm getting there. There are so many of you that I wanted to thank, but I needed to acknowledge all of you for giving me a boost when I was feeling pretty down. I did upload a short message onto the show feed. In case you didn't have a chance to listen, all of my thank yous that I owed are in there, and that includes those who had either joined Patreon if you raised your pledge to a different tier, or if you jumped in on the annual membership deal, or you contributed to the production of this podcast through PayPal. In the ways that you know that you reach out to me, all of you, I hope I got all of you, are acknowledged in that 9-minute update. I was able to finish up the 4-part series over there on Patreon. We covered the 1985 murder of 17-year-old Missy Avila. And those episodes are now available to patrons at all tier levels. It's a very heartbreaking story. I read the book and I was able to share so many more details that you wouldn't necessarily find in articles online, especially when it comes to cases that are as old as Missy's case, which is about 35 years. I know it's been some time since I wrapped up the last series here on the regular feed. That was 4 parts to the murder of Marion Parker. I also got a lot of information from a book on that case as well. So that series, those 4 parts, has tons of details as well too. This was actually the first time in both the Patreon episode 4-part series and the one on the regular feed where I relied on books on these cases and constructed these show episodes around those books. Most, not all, but most of our cases are 1 case per episode, but if I use a book as reference material, then I'm fairly certain that there are going to be multi-parts. I did like getting into all of the intimate details, but I also don't like to drag a case on for too long. So I'm trying different things to see if I can find some sort of happy medium. As for this story that we are covering today, I do have a book on it. I might have a couple of books. They were sent to me by listener Nate B. However, there is also a plethora of information about the story online. So I have to admit to you, I'm kind of winging it right now. I'm not sure which direction I'm going to go. I'm pretty sure I'm going to go ahead and look into the book, and I'm winging it. It's been a couple of days since I've kind of pulled myself out of this funk that I've been in. And the only thing I really want to do is get these episodes out there for you as soon as possible. So I'm going along with the story just as you are. I am familiar with the story, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be tons of details that are going to be new to me and they're going to be new to you. So let's get started. Let's dive into it. We are starting from scratch here for this vacation series, episode number 183. And I'm fairly certain it's going to be a multi-part series, but I promise I will get through it as quickly as possible. This is the tale of the Kissel Family Curse. The patriarch of the Kissel family, William Kissel, he is billed to his close friends and family. He reflects back longingly in speaking about his family that once was, living and raising his family in New Jersey and Vermont and various places in the Northeast. He has a lot of fond memories of vacations, skiing on the slopes of Stratton Mountain, Vermont with his wife, Elaine, his daughter, Jane, and his two sons, Robert and Andrew. However, by the spring of 2006, Bill's family had dwindled from the 5 of them all the way down to just 2. And all Bill had left was his one daughter. And she was clear across the country from where he was now residing in Florida. She was in the state of Washington. And there was a seemingly never-ending battle between the remnants of extended family over who is most fit to finish raising his grandchildren. Bill seemingly speaks with so much forlornness, thinking back to the times when his family was so full and complete and alive. He keeps with him a handful of fading snapshots of what used to be, a time before the happiness was swallowed up by what everyone began to believe was the Kissel family curse. Why a curse? Because the odds, even on the best days, even on the worst days, are never like this. They are astronomically impossible, the proverbial lightning striking twice, as they say. But for the Kissels, the impossible odds lined up just right. And it left Bill trying to figure out how inconceivably unfair life had been for his family and how these events, by the standards of probability, simply don't happen in this order, in this manner, in this way. And therein lies this story. How and why did this loving, devoted father who spent his entire life working to give the world to his family end up burying not 1, but 2 of his children? In order to answer that question, I'm going to have to take you back a few years. Back when brothers Andrew and Robert were on their way to building lives of their own, building families of their own, carving their own paths in life, before everything began going sideways. So dreamers, I'm going to do the best that I can to keep the main characters of this story clearly identified for you. In fact, because the story centers around brothers Andrew and Robert, I actually for myself made 2 columns in a notebook and labeled one for Andrew and one for Robert and listed their important information side by side so it would be easy for me to refer to as we went along here, and I'm going to try to keep it straight for you as well. Andrew Kissel was the older brother. He was born August 23rd, 1959. Robert, he was younger by about 2 years and 8 months, born April 21st, 1962. They have a sister. She seems to have rigorously maintained her privacy, so I'm unsure where she falls in terms of birth order. In fact, she isn't even listed on the family obituary pages. All it says is private. But I do know her name is Jane Kissel Clayton. As I said in the introduction of this episode, Andrew was the older brother, but it was younger brother Robert who would outgrow, outperform, and outshine him as they reached adulthood. And we know that brothers are competitive. These brothers were also. But at some point, younger brother Robert managed to surpass Andrew. And it seems as though Andrew resorted to taking shortcuts and taking the easy way in and out of things in order to try and keep up with his younger brother. At least, that seems to be the general consensus in various articles and publications when describing and comparing and contrasting the two of them and the dynamics of their relationship. I don't have siblings, so rivalry, competition, and being compared to someone else simply isn't a part of my experience. And I am the mother of an only child, so I can't even see it from that perspective either. From the people that I have known or have been friends with that have older siblings and younger siblings and whatnot, it seems like the younger and the middle child is always the one trying to catch up or keep up with the older one. But in this particular story, the script was kind of flipped. It was the younger one who easily breezed past the older one when it came to school and sports, which we can easily see could create a perfect environment for fierce competition between these siblings, especially when you're getting lapped by your little bro, right? So, in order to get there, let's back up a few years and attempt to identify the point where the very first cracks begin to form in the Kissel family. First, let's start with a gentleman by the name of Frank Shea. Frank was a Vietnam veteran turned NYPD detective. However, a debilitating car accident in the late 1980s derailed his career and sent him into an unexpected early retirement. But he took his skills and connections as a decorated detective and began freelancing as an investigator for attorneys working on things like personal injury cases and acrimonious divorces and whatnot. So within the decade, Frank had become so flush with work that he formed his own agency called the Alpha Group Investigations. While the group investigated a variety of cases for an assortment of clients, one of his specialties were spouses who may be suspecting that there might be some infidelity going on. They would seek out and hire the Alpha Group to investigate and provide them with the proof that they needed, particularly if divorce was on the horizon and there was a lot at stake in terms of child custody or assets. Proof of adultery can be pivotal when it comes to the court battle over these things. Well, there eventually came a time when one of the Kissel brothers, the younger one, Robert, felt as though he needed the services of Frank and the Alpha Group. He called him up and he told him that he had some suspicions, and bottom line, he just needed to know. And this is how Frank Shea became intertwined in the story of the Kissel Family Curse. Keep his name on the back burner. Don't worry, when I bring him up again, I will remind you who he is and who he's working for. The next important player in our story is a gentleman by the name of Lance Del Priore. He was the founder of a company located in Brattleboro, Vermont called Prime Focus Communications. This started off as a company that installed satellite dishes sometime in 1986, and he would eventually go on to branch out into audio and video installation. And as the internet started coming around, he got involved in that, as well as home security systems. And to have a little bit of an understanding how Lance got into this business, we need to just dive a little bit into his background as well. Now, Lance Del Priore was one of 5 children to an abusive mother and a father who walked out on the entire family when Lance was only 4 years old. He was raised in a very rural area of the most northeastern part of the state of Connecticut. Lance was very young when his father left, so it was his older brother Mike who was more deeply affected by the abandonment of their dad. And this would ultimately shape and impact how both of their lives would go. However, as far as Lance was concerned, he really understood why his dad left, because he considered his mom to be one of the worst, most abusive, despicable people he'd ever known. According to some of the details outlined in the book that I mentioned at the beginning of this, A Family Cursed, all 5 kids were regularly abused, beaten, and degraded. One of their punishments was even to have their heads submerged in the toilet while mom flushed it. As Lance saw it, he just couldn't blame his dad for bailing out. He would have done the same exact thing if he was married to a woman like his mother. Now, I haven't been around a lot of people who suffered child abuse. I am not a child abuser. I'm just going to have to assume that there comes a point in time when an abusive parent simply isn't going to be able to abuse their children anymore, simply due to the fact that they become grown. Like I said, I don't have a great deal of personal experience in things like this when it comes to physical abuse. While mental and emotional abuse may be closer to things that I have experienced when it comes to physical abuse, I just have come to believe that when it comes to physical abuse, that the victim eventually becomes capable of defending him or herself. And that may not be as easy when it comes to mental and emotional abuse to punch back or hit. It's different. I had a family member on my mother's side, which shouldn't surprise any of you who are familiar with my mother's wacky side of the family. A male family member who was so severely abused by his mother throughout his entire childhood that by the time he got to his mid-teens, he had outsized both of his parents, though it was his mother that was his main abuser. She was finally no longer able to continue the physical abuse because he had become so violent himself, and that's what I mean. You can only bully and abuse your children to a point. They're going to become adults, and the tables might just turn on you. So that's exactly what happened here to Lance and his abusive mother. When he was about 16, his mom had gotten so angry at him about something that she was getting ready to just haul off and kick his ass when he stopped her in her tracks. He grabbed her by the neck with one hand and told her, "Touch me one more time and I will stab you to death." And that was the end of it for him. He considered himself basically an orphan. He sought various places to stay, halfway homes, things of that sort. But he eventually connected with a family member, an uncle, though I don't know if it was on his father's side or his mother's side. Just an uncle gave him a job working for his own satellite dish company up in Vermont. This was the early 80s around that time. Cable TV was becoming a thing, but when it came to places outside the city, the more rural areas, services for cable were not so readily available, so the answer to that were to have these big satellite dishes, and probably there's a lot of you who remember those. They were huge, not like the direct TV dishes that we've seen around the last 20 years or so, if that's even still a thing. I have no idea. We used to have one. We had, I think it was Dish Network sometime in the 2000s. But everything is so internet-based now, I can't even remember the last time I even thought about a satellite TV dish until I started looking into this episode. But by 1986, Lance was actually able to branch off from his uncle. He had taken all that he had learned and launched his own business that he called Prime Focus Communications. Speaking of satellite TV, I'm sure you've heard of DirecTV. I think I mentioned Dish Network, but here in this particular case, DirecTV is the one we're focusing on at the moment. Once satellite TV was becoming more streamlined and the size of the dishes were becoming much, much smaller and more manageable, and people were opting for the dish services as opposed to cable, Lance and his business had actually gained an exclusive contract with DirecTV for the area in which he serviced. So Prime Focus suddenly became flush with work and revenue. And as the popularity of satellite TV continued to grow, it wasn't just the rural areas' answer to unavailable cable service, but people who did have cable began switching to satellite. It was competition and there were price wars and all that stuff. So Lance was finding himself traveling further and further outside of his area, getting people to set up their satellites. And like I said, we carried on into the new millennium. Technology was evolving. It seemed like every day. Internet was getting faster. People were getting online. TVs were getting thinner and smarter. Wish we were getting thinner and smarter too, right? People were becoming more and more connected. So Lance and Prime Focus branched off into home audio and video installation, setting up computer systems for internet networking, and as I mentioned, home security systems. He had his hands into everything that was growing in popularity going into the 2000s, and his business became quite successful. In fact, Lance, remember I told you he was raised with 4 other siblings. From what I understand, there were 4 brothers and 1 sister, a total of 5 of them. Lance brought in 2 of his brothers and 1 sister. However, he was hesitant to bring in his oldest brother, Mike. He just had this feeling that what he knew of his brother and his personality, that it was going to probably be challenging to work with him. But Lance was very loyal to his family, something he definitely wanted to set himself apart from in terms of how he was raised by his parents, particularly his mother being so abusive and his father, basically abandoning them all. So he wasn't going to be so quick to turn away from family, even though there was a part of him that knew that his brother Mike was going to be a problem. So the year was 1999, and we're going to shift back towards talking about the Kissel family. The older brother, Andrew, he had made a name for himself in the world of real estate investment. He worked out of New York. He was married to his wife, Haley, and together they had 2 children. By 1999, Andrew had become tremendously wealthy, and around that time, he had purchased a vacation home in the place where he used to vacation with his family as a child, Stratton Mountain, Vermont, and from which I read online is one of the most popular ski destinations for those who live in and around the better part of the northeastern section of the United States. And it looks like it's about the same distance from New York City to Stratton Mountain if you were going to drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, about 4 hours away. So Andrew Kissel, he acquired this 6-bedroom vacation home, and he was having some work and renovations done to it, and he hired some contractors, and at some point, Andrew brought up getting his home set up with the audio, video, satellite, internet security, all the bells and whistles. And the general contractor had a recommendation for him. I know this guy. He's good. His name is Lance, and his company is called Prime Focus. And from that, Andrew Kissel and Lance Del Priore became acquainted. In fact, Lance and Andrew got along like fast friends. They both were really friendly, outgoing, sociable, easygoing guys. And Lance ended up hooking up the Stratton Mountain vacation home with the most state-of-the-art electronic audio, video, networking, internet security systems available at the time, all of this good stuff. Lance also became acquainted with Haley, Andrew's wife. She was a little bit of a tough nut to crack, but eventually she warmed up to the guy, and both the Kissels became not only people that Lance worked for, but they became friends. In the end, the Kissels end up spending upwards of $100,000 on all of the work that Lance had completed. So, yeah, they're good friends. So, it wouldn't be a true sibling rivalry if Robert Kissel didn't up and buy his own Stratton Mountain, Vermont vacation home too, which he did, and it seems it wasn't too much long after Andrew had acquired his. By this time, Robert Kissel was a finance guy, a Wall Street trader, very much a success in his own right. Who was more successful at the time? I don't know for sure at this point. I don't know if it was ever really apparent who was actually earning more money, if it was Andrew or Robert. But we will come to find that one of the brothers was a little bit more shady about his business dealings than the other. And it was most certainly a thing that grew from the competitive nature of the relationship between the brothers. And as we've found time and time again in our stories in these podcasts, shadiness in business will only take you so far when it comes to money and real estate or whatever. You end up with a house of cards, and that house of cards will eventually come crashing down. But anyway, Andrew hooked younger brother Robert up with his electronics tech guy, Lance. And Lance, he did have employees, including his own brother, older brother Mike. And some of the work on Robert's house he gave to Mike to take care of. Lance and Mike, they were only a couple years apart in age, but in just being a couple years apart, the impact of the dysfunction of their family from their abusive mom and their absentee father had much more of a profound effect on Mike than it did on Lance, just because he was slightly older. Now, it may have more to do with than just age. You have to factor in personality types, life experiences, and other variables, But it was clear that Mike had taken their father's abandonment much harder than Lance did. When they became adults, Lance was able to branch off into his own business. He found God. He married a woman named Mary, with whom he developed a very close, loving, trusting, solid relationship with. Mike, however, he had stayed living and working with their uncle and his satellite business much longer than Lance had. He was an angry person. He was very selfish and self-centered. He had very little ambition and preferred to keep to himself. He interacted with his family, but there were definitely walls that he had put up around himself. But Lance, he still cared for his brother deeply, despite Mike being distant and resentful most of the time. Mike did get married. Her name was Sherry. Lance thought she was good for Mike. She was sweet and beautiful, and she adored him. Mike always swore that he would never, ever be like their dad. Never. He would never turn his back on his family. He would never abandon his wife and kids. But less than 5 years into his marriage with Sherry and 2 children later, that is exactly what Mike did. Not only did he walk out on all 3 of them, he did so by way of taking most of their worldly possessions with him and leaving behind a note that he was finished with Sherry and the kids. Mike, who was pushing 30, had become enamored with a young 18-year-old with whom he left the northeastern area of the U.S. and moved all the way down south to the state of Alabama, where their father happened to live and set up house with his new young girlfriend. So much for being nothing like their father, right? Before long, Mike's 18-year-old girlfriend was pregnant. They were slated to get married, but just before they said their I do's, Mike found himself with an even younger 15-year-old and decided that she was the one for him and left the 18-year-old with the child behind. If you think Mike stuck with the 15-year-old, you'd be mistaken. He ended up shacking up with an exotic dancer for a while, but as soon as the 15-year-old turned 18, he dumped the dancer and married her. Her name was Melissa. I guess because she was legal by then. I don't know. But anyway. While Mike was off in Alabama playing musical girlfriends, he and Lance were kind of estranged. I mean, I guess they really had no reason to be interacting all that much since Mike was off, quote unquote, finding himself, if I'm being nice about it. How much time had passed? It had been several years by then. I'm not exactly clear on that, but Lance and Mike eventually reconnected, and Mike ended up moving back to the northeastern part of the country and rejoined his brother working for Prime Focus, bringing his wife, Melissa, and their child with them. The time apart seemed to have done well for the brothers as their working relationship became better than ever. But after a couple of months, Mike actually wanted to be more of an equal in the work relationship. Lance, of course, was the owner, and Mike, well, he wanted to be co-owner. While business was good and profitable, there were times when the company had to take its hits. So Lance told him, look, that's all fine and well that you want to be a part of this when we're flush with work and profits, but you have to be prepared to share in the downside of the business as well. Sometimes things don't always go our way. Sometimes we are hit with substantial losses, and you're going to have to be willing to share in that side of the business as well. I guess that aspect of joining in a partnership hadn't really crossed Mike's mind when he brought it up, so he decided against becoming an equal partner. However, instead of being an installation technician, Mike went into the sales side of it all. Lance paid Mike a generous salary, plus commissions and bonuses. He eventually even helped Mike purchase his first home. It was a trailer, but it was still a home, and it was his. Business was good. It was as good as it had ever been, but eventually problems started trickling in. Whenever there's something or someone new that happens or comes along, there's always that so-called honeymoon period. Well, Mike had rejoined Prime Focus Communications. He had a lucrative new position as a sales rep for the company. He had this young new wife and a new kid who had moved back to the Northeast from Alabama with him. He was a homeowner. I mean, life was good. But for Mike, now that everything had kind of fallen into place, it seemed like he sort of began to slack off a little bit. Customers began contacting the Prime Focus offices, voicing problems and issues that they had had with Mike. Some of them said that when he showed up to their home, he was exceptionally rude. He had an overall sour disposition, a poor attitude, and they would really prefer to deal with someone else within the company if they intended to continue to do business with Prime Focus. It also didn't help that Lance's wife, Mary, she couldn't stand Mike either, to the point where she wouldn't even allow Mike to set foot inside their home. She had seen what the customers had seen. The guy was absolutely unfriendly, unsmiling, and a complete energy suck whenever he was around. She could not stand the negative vibes that followed Mike around everywhere that he went and all but refused to be around him. But the one redeeming quality that Mike had that was valuable to Lance and his company was the fact that Mike was masterful when it came to the home security systems and getting that stuff installed up and running. That was the work that he was doing when he was living in Alabama, and his skills were exactly what Lance needed to round out Prime Focus communications beyond satellite TV and internet. And really, an aspect of working in the home security branch of the business meant that Mike really didn't have to interact all that much with customers. He just needed to go in, get the work done, and get out. But realistically, it's virtually impossible to avoid all customer contact. So the contact that Mike was having, so much of it was so bad to a point that customers were going out of their way to voice their complaints. So Lance was torn. Not only was Mike his brother, his family, the fact is he's one of the best people he had on his staff. He was so detail-oriented. He was thorough. His work was top-notch. Just if it weren't for his crappy attitude, things would be perfect. Mike Del Priore was the one who had not only installed the security systems for both Andrew and Robert Kissel Stratton Mountain Vacation Homes, he had done all the work the brothers had contracted for the company. Mike had done everything for both Kissel brothers. So, hang in there, dreamers. I know this is a lot of side details about this company, but stay with me because it's important and I am going to tie it all together, I promise. As I had mentioned earlier, Lance had come to know the older Kissel brother first, Andrew, and later on Andrew would recommend Lance to his brother Robert when he purchased his vacation home. Lance had taken a liking to both brothers. He thought very highly of both of them, and he would eventually consider them to not just be clients, but to be friends. And I did mention earlier that Lance had also become friends with Andrew's wife, Haley, though she took a little longer to warm up. Eventually she did. However, when it came to Robert's wife, Nancy, she was a whole different story. Nancy Kissel had a very cold and abrasive personality. Whenever Lance was around her, he couldn't help but notice how tyrannical she ran the household, particularly when it came to their hired help. Specifically, what that help was, I can't be completely sure, but I would imagine it would be your standard housekeeper, perhaps the landscaping personnel, maybe a nanny for the 3 children that she and Robert had. Lance never saw Nancy speak to any of her household staff with any measure of kindness or respect. She was demanding, she was dictatorial, she shouted commands, and the treatment wasn't limited to the permanent staff at home. She treated anyone that she and Robert hired to do any kind of work around their home like that. Lance just figured she was one of those spoiled housewives of New England, if there was such a show. She'd be the star, front and center. Well, anyway, Prime Focus Communications was Lance's bread and butter, so he learned over the years, no matter what you are faced with when it comes to customers, he's got to dig deep and keep it as friendly and cordial as possible, no matter what. Especially when you have clients like the Kissels who have money to burn. With an ever-evolving world of technology, the first trip to their home is never going to be the last. Lance, with a reputation of his business always at the forefront of his priorities, he took on the Nancy Kissel challenge and he won her over, as much as he could have anyway. He felt like that they had a manageable working relationship, and she never really barked or snapped at him the way she did others, and she really had nothing negative or untoward to say about Lance or his company. Over time, Lance had begun to see past Nancy's callous personality. And once he had been able to get himself past all that, eventually he did take notice of just how exceptionally beautiful and well put together Nancy Kissel actually was. Wait, what? Yeah, Lance, he noticed. But really, he was relieved to know that there was a different side to Nancy Kissel, that she wasn't this impossible to work with tyrant. Because once he got past that initial ugliness that he had seen in her personality, he was able to see the better, nicer qualities in Nancy, and she eventually grew on him. Of course, Nancy Kissel was a very beautiful woman. She always had perfectly styled hair. She was always dressed to the nines. There was never a time when prime focus was out at Nancy and Robert's house that this woman was anything short of stunning. And Lance did finally discover a very sweet, engaging, magnetic personality, which made him glad that he didn't run the other direction when it came to the first impressions that he had of her. And before anyone ever really noticed, prime focus actually had been working on Robert and Nancy's vacation home for more than 2 years. Yes, 2 years. In contrast, to put that into perspective, the work that they had did at Andrew and Haley Kissel's house only took 2 weeks. But somehow they had managed to keep themselves on Nancy and Robert's payroll for more than 2 years. How in the world did that happen? How much work can a company do for one house when it comes to TV, audio, video, internet, networking, and security? I mean, Prime Focus literally managed to pretty much become a part of their permanent domestic staff. And at the time, if anyone were to ask Lance about it, all he could do was shrug. He actually had no idea what the holdup was. Why had they been coming and going from the Kissel home for 2 years and still not finished all the work? Lance tried to rationalize it in his own head. Maybe this had something to do with the fact that this was only a vacation home. The couple really didn't know what they wanted or needed. They weren't necessarily in any kind of hurry to get the house set up and wired with the technology. They were just taking their time to make sure that they were getting what they needed to suit them. Lance really had no idea. But eventually, he did begin to notice that his brother Mike was talking somewhat excessively about Nancy Kissel to him. And he started to notice that the conversations that he was having with Mike about her were beginning to extend beyond a professional company-client relationship. At first, Lance didn't think much of it. After all, he liked all 4 of the Kissels himself, a lot. He himself had come to find that even the most offensive one of them, Nancy, had a softer side that he came to know and like. But when Mike began being invited over to Nancy and Robert's house for socializing or dinners, and Mike was going without his wife, Melissa, and Mike was starting to do quote-unquote favors for Nancy outside of the scope of their work with Prime Focus, Lance finally had to speak up and tell him, dude, I don't think it's okay for you to cross any more lines with these clients. He could just tell by the way Mike was talking about Nancy, it was more like gushing about Nancy. He knew the woman could be very alluring, but he implored that his brother keep it on the level. Keep it professional. She is off limits. She is a married woman. But considering that we know what we know about Mike and him jumping from one woman to another, even worse, one teenager to another in the past, this is not a man who shies away from blurring lines and crossing them. Lance told him straight up, you don't need to do Nancy any favors. If she needs help, she has more than enough money to hire someone to do anything that she needs to be done for her. They are in the business of cable TV and home security. Leave it at that. Now, it is important to understand that in this 2-year time span that Prime Focus was coming and going from the Kissel home, the fact is that Nancy and Robert had actually moved away from Vermont and New York, or they had places in both places. I'll get to it later. They moved away and had gone to Hong Kong. And this was a move that they had made in 1997. The purchase of the Vermont home happened sometime after that, so they'd, of course, have a place to stay anytime the couple traveled stateside. Robert Kissel had taken a very, very lucrative finance job with Goldman Sachs and was assigned to work out of their Hong Kong location. So this might better explain about why those 2 years happened, because the Kissels weren't always around. But anyway, Robert, Nancy, and their 3 children resided in this community in Hong Kong that was specifically comprised of expatriates, or expats for short. Basically, they are people living in Hong Kong that are citizens of other countries. I really didn't know too much about these types of communities in other countries until I began researching this story, but apparently these expat communities are pretty self-contained, and anyone who lives there really doesn't have to travel beyond the little bubble that they live in and sustain themselves within. And the community tends to become pretty tight-knit. I mean, of course, not everyone is American, but nobody is from Hong Kong. So you might meet people from Europe or Australia, and you share this common thing of being a foreigner in this country. And the Kissels were able to forge some pretty solid friendships with several other English-speaking expats. It becomes a pretty tight-knit group over time, and people tend to relate, particularly when it comes to living in a different foreign place, being homesick, things of that sort. Anyway, I think that kind of helps put into perspective why the work that Lance and Mike had been doing at Robert and Nancy's house had been taking so much time. They were overseas a lot, living and working on the other side of the world. Okay, so right now we're going to go a little off topic, but again, it will all tie in, I promise. But for right now, I want to talk to you about the coronavirus. As you know, for more than a year now, the world has pretty much been under siege with the COVID-19 outbreak. As of the writing of this episode, 3.39 million people have died as a result of COVID-19. But things seem to be getting better as the rollout of the vaccine has been happening, and we're starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not sure how things are looking in the neck of the woods that you all are in, but in the recent update that I uploaded to the show feed, I told you that I had recently gone to the New York casino last week, and people were without masks all over the place. And it doesn't seem to be an uptick in COVID cases yet, so fingers crossed with that. Now, this is not the first coronavirus outbreak, but it has been the one that has impacted us the most in terms of our day-to-day lives. We had shutdowns, we had quarantines, we had this new thing called social distancing, we had face mask mandates. It was unlike anything any of us had ever seen in our lifetimes. And the reason I am bringing this up in the story about the Kissel family brothers is because during their time that their story was taking place, there was an outbreak of the strain of the coronavirus that did sort of have an impact on the direction that this story would go. It was called SARS, which stood for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. On the CDC website, that's the Center for Disease Control, they have posted a timeline of key events related to SARS. It was in November of 2002 when the very first case of what was described as a atypical pneumonia was reported in the Guangdong province of southern China. However, it lists SARS as first being discovered in Asia in February of 2003. I believe that has a little bit to do with China trying to suppress the news of this. But this SARS would eventually spread to about 24 countries in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, and it persisted for about 6 months. SARS was officially eradicated in July of 2003. In March of 2003, the World Health Organization issued a worldwide alert regarding this severe form of pneumonia of unknown origin found in patients in China, Vietnam, and Hong Kong. The CDC issued its own health alert shortly thereafter. By March 24, 2003, the CDC labs officially identified this outbreak to be a new coronavirus, possibly having been the cause of SARS. At that time, 39 cases in the United States were identified. At that point, the CDC prepared for the possibility of a pandemic. Travel alerts were issued. However, by May 6, 2003, containment of the strain of the coronavirus was successful. By June, travel alerts from Asia were eased. And in the end, all of the countries that reported case of SARS totaled 8,096, and that resulted in 774 deaths. By January of 2004, it was discovered that the source of the SARS strain of the coronavirus was caused by civets, which is a nocturnal mammal found in Asia and Africa. You can look up pictures of this animal. It's described by the CDC as sort of cat-like, but with a longer, lean body and a mask similar to like a raccoon. They had been sold in Chinese meat markets in the Yunnan province and was carried from bats to humans. Now, obviously, COVID-19 was not as easily contained and eradicated as SARS was, but it was similarly transmitted. The family of coronaviruses that are found in cats and bats and sometimes camels, and these animals, they don't get infected by the virus, but they carry them and spread them to others, including humans. And it jumps from species to species, and eventually humans do become infected. We know that the first cases of COVID-19 were in the Wuhan province of China from the meat markets, and it spread so easily because all it took was close contact with an infected person. The reasons why COVID-19 has been more problematic than SARS is because COVID-19 spreads much more easily than SARS, and people infected with COVID-19 were and are spreading the infection before there were any noticeable symptoms. There were no reported cases of SARS that were spread prior to the infected person showing symptoms of the virus, meaning that the person was already obviously very sick before they became contagious. So naturally, if you know someone is sick, you're going to stay away. With COVID, the perfectly healthy looking and feeling person is extremely contagious. So dreamers, I didn't actually do any comparing and contrasting of the two different outbreaks until I began researching this case. And I don't know if any of you had either, but I thought it was pretty interesting, and hopefully the lessons this time when it comes to food handling and whatnot are not forgotten. Okay, so you're probably sitting here thinking, what does SARS have to do with this story? Well, I told you that the first cases of SARS were identified in 2003 in China, Vietnam, and Hong Kong. And I also told you that Nancy and Robert Kissel had moved to Hong Kong for work. And that's exactly where they still were when the SARS outbreak began. Now, China started seeing the very first cases of this atypical pneumonia in November of 2002, but the country had moved quickly to contain the news. And they did the same thing when COVID-19 began, but it wasn't for very long. The attempted cover-up only lasted no more than a week before China finally acknowledged that there was a very quick spreading virus going on. However, when it came to SARS in 2003, China continued suppressing the news of the outbreak until it reached Hong Kong in February of 2003. When that happened, the expats living in Hong Kong began leaving the country in droves, and this included Nancy Kissel and her 3 kids. Robert Kissel stayed behind, dedicating himself to continuing his work. So by early 2003, the couple were living apart, Robert in Hong Kong and Nancy with the kids at their vacation home in Vermont. And also by this time, Mike Del Priore was separated from his wife. Remember, the last couple of years, whenever the Kissels were stateside, Mike and his partner were frequently at the home working on whatever it was they were working on. But this time around, Nancy was there pretty much on her own. Of course, she wanted to have her house hooked up with the TV and the internet and all that jazz. And naturally, she would call their go-to guy, Mike. And this time around, not only was Mike no longer in a committed relationship with his wife, and not only was Nancy there without her significant other as well, Mike was also now working alone, no longer part of a two-man crew. And within weeks, the relationship between Mike and Nancy had turned sexual. From what I've seen and read, and from what I've even told you thus far in this episode, Mike Del Priore, he has a difficult time adhering to boundaries and finding balance in his life. By this time, it was getting into the fall of 2003. Mike's life had really begun spiraling out of control. There was one particular evening when his brother Lance was hosting a get-together with some of his friends from church when Mike came pounding on the front door. He was a mess, and he asked Lance to come outside, and before he knew it, Mike was falling to pieces, sobbing that he can't believe what he's done. Lance just stood there unsure of what to think or do. He just kept thinking to himself, geez, what now, Mike? What now? The first thing Lance thought was he's got more problems with his wife. The guy never really could seem to be able to find peace, love, and comfort in any of his marriages. By then, this was his second one that was headed towards divorce. In fact, he barely even got to see his kid except for short visits that were court-ordered to be supervised. Then there was an occasion when Lance's wife, Mary, saw Mike in town. He didn't see her, but she saw him when she knew that he was supposed to have been at a job site miles away from where he was at. If he was there, then who was doing the work that he was scheduled to do? And it was not too long after that Lance and Mary, when working on the books and the accounting, they came to notice that Mike was logging hours of work for himself when he was actually not at the job sites, and the company was paying him out for his time. He was also using business accounts to make purchases for non-business related things. So, as Mike was standing there sobbing, these are the things that are running through Lance's head, but finally Mike blurts out what he had done. He admitted that he had been having an affair with Nancy Kissel for about 6 months by then, and he was fairly certain that her husband Robert had found them out. Somehow Robert had been able to hack into Nancy's email account, and it was there where he discovered some very personal and intimate communications between the two of them. Mike told Lance, look, Robert is probably going to get in touch with you. He's going to call. So if he does, please, just please don't say anything to Robert about him and Nancy. Just keep it to yourself. But Lance was livid. How could his brother put their business and their reputation in jeopardy like this? Did he have no idea what this could do to them if it's found out that their company representative is having an affair with a married client? How could he? How can Mike be so selfish and self-centered? It was always like that, but Lance thought that maybe he had grown up. Maybe he had changed. Maybe he had seen the error of his ways, but no. Mike does what Mike wants because it's always about Mike. Mike just stood there in silence, really having nothing that he could possibly say for himself. Lance asked him if the affair was still ongoing, but Mike assured him that it was over. But Lance was skeptical. As the brothers stood there on the porch trying to figure out if Mike had sunk their business for good, Lance couldn't help but notice a very, very expensive piece of jewelry that Mike was wearing. Mike really didn't have anything nice or expensive. It just wasn't his thing. He never had the money. But it was definitely something that he could see Nancy being really into. She always sported expensive, flashy things. So Lance took Mike to task. Where'd you get that? Who gave it to you? Lance already knew the answers, even though Mike stood there with nothing to say. He knew that Nancy must have gifted that to him. There was no doubt about that. But here's the thing. Nancy is a stay-at-home mom. Even though, dreamers, I will sit here and say that in a marriage, all things are equal, no matter who is out there in the workforce and who is at home putting it down with the house and the kids, it's a team effort regardless. But as Lance saw it, Nancy was the homemaker, Robert was overseas earning 7 figures. It doesn't take a genius to know that essentially Robert is the one paying for that exquisite piece of jewelry that Mike was wearing. And because Mike was sleeping with the man's wife, and because that wife had taken money from her marriage and purchased this piece of jewelry without Robert's knowledge, to Lance it was just as bad as if Mike had stolen that piece of jewelry directly from Robert. This wasn't a gift, it was a theft. And the only right thing to do would be to remove that ill-gotten trinket from his person and return it to its rightful owner. If nothing else, if the affair is truly over with Nancy, if there is nothing more between them, then the only thing to do would be to give it back. And for Lance, because he knew his brother was shallow and materialistic, if he was willing to part with the jewelry, then he could believe in his candor and his veracity. But Mike refused. He wouldn't give it back. This was a gift. He shouldn't be forced to give back something that he was given in order to prove anything to anyone. So Lance issued his brother an ultimatum. Give back the jewelry or you will be fired from Prime Focus Communications. Without a word, Mike turned around, stepped off his brother's front porch, and walked away. Lance went back to the house, and he was speaking to a mutual friend of his and Mike's, a gentleman by the name of Russell. He asked him, what should he do? How is he to approach this situation? Lance tried to put himself in Robert's place. What if it was my wife that was having an affair behind my back? I'd want someone to tell me so I wouldn't be made a fool. Maybe Nancy will learn her lesson this time. If she got caught and she saw how much she had to lose, perhaps in the long run, it would cause her to see the error of her ways. And maybe she would be able to work things out with Robert and all of this could just quietly pass. Eventually, before going to bed that night, Lance would come to the conclusion that it would be best for him to just stay out of it. He wouldn't say anything to either Robert or Nancy. In the days that followed, Mike had turned to some mutual friends and acquaintances of his and Lance in an attempt to garner some support and to defend himself and his actions, but it really didn't go over that well. Nobody was okay with Mike putting the lucrative business that Lance had spent years building into jeopardy. Without any help, without any support, and without any friends, Mike finally decided that the jewelry he had was not worth the loss of his job, his livelihood, or his brother. So he went ahead and contacted Lance and told him that he would turn the gift over to him if that's what it would take for him to get back to work and to their relationship as brothers. In the end, Lance told him, look, I just want to see you make that decision. I want to see that I could have faith in you to do the right thing. And now he sees that he had come to a place where he was ready to do that. So Lance took the piece of jewelry and welcomed Mike back to the business with open arms. But that reconciliation was short-lived. After Mike had been back on the job for only about 2 weeks, another one of their employees came to speak privately with Lance and told him that Mike showed up wearing a brand new piece of jewelry that Nancy had just given him. Lance had had it. Mike was in the middle of an installation when Lance went ahead and dispatched someone else to the job site to take over. He called Mike and told him to vacate the home that he was in immediately. Someone else was coming to finish the work. They're done. He's fired. Lance acknowledged that nobody is perfect. Even he isn't perfect. But he could just no longer have Mike be a part of his company. He accepted this new gift and it was just too much. He had pushed Lance over the edge. It would be like allowing this malignant tumor to grow and fester and destroy their reputations and their business if they kept him on. No amount of family loyalty was enough to want to continue to allow this to go on any longer. Mike had to go for good. Of course, Mike, wanting to get the last word in edgewise, issued some threats, and he told Lance that he would burn his business down to the ground, and then he ended the call. But a day later, Mike called Lance back and tried a different tactic. He was like, bro, let's try to get back to how things were before. You know, you and me, thick as thieves, we're close, we're brothers, we're a team. We've been through so much, yada, yada, yada. But Lance was having none of it, reminding Mike that he was the one responsible for all of this, that he was putting everything at risk. Himself, his family, his job, his livelihood. Mike risked it all for a fling with a married woman and a piece of gaudy jewelry. It was too much to lose for a meaningless affair. The conversation veered towards Mike issuing more threats and insisting that he be given a severance, but Lance told Mike to consider him not kicking his ass as a severance package. Then Mike demanded that Lance give him back the jewelry that he had taken from him, and Lance was more than happy to give it back. He wanted nothing to do with Mike or any of that anymore. So yeah, Mike traded everything, his entire life, his job, his family, everything, for a piece of jewelry. That very same night was a couple hours before midnight. Lance's wife, Mary, she had headed over to the Prime Focus offices with her son, also named Lance Jr., so that they could swap out the locks on the doors. They weren't able to get the keys from Mike, so to just be safe, they wanted to change the locks so Mike wouldn't be able to make good on his promise to destroy their business. But when they got there, Mary realized that she forgot to bring the original keys in, so she told her son to hang out there and wait while she ran home to get the keys. Well, as Lance Jr. was waiting, his uncle Mike just happened to show up. He'd been fired, so he had really no business being there. Really not knowing what else to do, Lance Jr. went ahead and made a phone call to the police. By the time Mary got back, law enforcement had already arrived. It was suspicious that Mike was there so late at night, but he tried to claim that he was coming to collect his final paycheck, but there had been no plan or arrangement for that to happen, especially not at that late hour. So Mary went ahead and told the police that she and her family had received threats from Mike and requested that they remove him from the premises. About a week after this incident at the Prime Focus offices, Mike reached out to Lance. It was a last-ditch effort to bury the hatchet, but not only had the damage been done, in the week that had passed, Lance had come to learn just how involved Mike had been with Nancy Kissel, that the relationship between the two of them was much more than just an occasional secret hookup here and there. He discovered that there had been overnight stays between Mike and Nancy. They had regularly gone out for dinner and drinks, and they actually had a vacation to California planned together. It was just too much for Lance to take. He couldn't trust anybody that was capable of that level of betrayal. Brother or not, it didn't matter. He was not only going to have to let go of Mike once and for all, not just as someone who worked with him at Prime Focus, but he really no longer wanted to have him in his life as his brother either. But in order to walk away from the relationship without feeling guilty about it, Lance went ahead and severed the home security branch of Prime Focus from his company and allowed Mike to form his own private business. Lance could keep his work focused on satellite TV, audio, video, and internet services exclusively. Now, after all of this is said and done, I do have to point out that Robert Kissel, Nancy's husband, he wasn't exactly in the dark about all of this. You know, they'd been married for quite some time. They had 3 children together. When something in the relationship shifts, you just kind of know. And that's basically where Robert was at in 2003 as the year wore on. He was in Hong Kong despite the SARS outbreak, and his wife was stateside at their home in Vermont. It had actually become their only place of residence by then. They had decided at some point to sell the place that they had in New York City, which is where they lived prior to accepting the position in Hong Kong. But Robert's feelings, it was just that, a feeling. He had a hunch that something was up. And this is where the gentleman that I mentioned a little while ago came into the picture, that former NYPD detective turned private investigator Frank Shea. Robert had been confiding in a colleague at work about his suspicions, and Frank and his investigative services was highly recommended to him. So by June of 2003, Robert was in touch with Frank, and he told him what he suspected was going on. So Nancy had come back to the United States just as the SARS was hitting Hong Kong. That was in March. Basically, within 3 months, Robert was onto her. And at some point, he had been made aware that something was going on between his wife and Mike, the TV satellite security guy. Though I'm not sure if he found this information out on his own or if it was information that his PA found out. Whatever the case, he came to be in the know, and it was confirmed for him that there was indeed something serious going on between the two of them. But either way, Frank had started working for Robert. Robert told him that whatever was going on, it was either happening at their home in Vermont, and he also provided Frank with Mike's home address, which was that trailer that was in the city of Hinsdale, Vermont. Now, Robert had actually flown back to the United States a couple of months after hiring Frank because he needed to have a medical procedure done in New York. When he got there, he did question Nancy about the suspected infidelity. And it was pretty clear to her that Robert already knew, so there really was no denying it, but she told him, she said that it was over and she would not be seeing Mike anymore. But Robert later came to find out, through his PI, that while he was hospitalized in New York having that surgical procedure, Nancy had continued her affair with Mike. So Robert, even being stateside, laid up in the hospital recovering from surgery, it still didn't stop her from seeing her lover. After Robert recovered, all of them went back to Hong Kong. If you recall, when I talked about SARS, it was quickly eradicated and the threat was over by that July of 2003. So it was just in time for the Kissels to get back to their expat community and for the kids to begin school that fall. Robert was going to go ahead and give Nancy the benefit of the doubt. We are human. We are not perfect. We slip up. This Mike character certainly wasn't worth throwing away the life that he and Nancy had built together. So Robert was ready and willing to try to move forward and put the affair behind them. But he wasn't exactly putting his full 100% trust into his wife, not just yet. He still wanted to protect himself and his feelings and everything that he had invested in this marriage. Even though he wanted to have faith in his wife when she promised that the affair was no more, Robert simply could not let it go completely. And one of the main reasons for that is because Nancy, she simply was not the same person that he had once known. There was something missing from what they once were. Things weren't the same, and it was painfully obvious. Nancy was detached. She was cold. She never showed him any kind of love, affection, or emotion towards him. It was obvious that she no longer loved him. So Robert shifted his focus on what Nancy was doing behind his back. No matter how many times Nancy said there was no more affair, her actions and her demeanor were telling him otherwise. Robert began scrutinizing their cell phone bills each month, meticulously going over every single phone number, every single call, the durations of the call, and the days and times those calls would be taking place. Robert also purchased some computer software that enabled him to monitor the things that Nancy was doing on their home computer, and this is when he discovered the emails going back and forth between Nancy and Mike. So Robert knew that his wife had not ended the affair, and it did not seem as though she had any intentions of doing so. In all of his covert spying activities, Robert also came to discover that Nancy had procured a second secret cell phone on which she was making all of her phone calls to a number Robert had traced to belonging to Mike Del Priore. All of these calls took place during the hours that Robert was at his office at work. Robert's computer software also discovered an ongoing day-to-day instant messaging thread between Nancy and Mike that was active also during the time that Robert was away at work. And by this time, while Robert was doing his own investigating now, he had forged a friendship with the private investigator that he had hired, Frank Shea. And Frank had become somewhat of a sounding board, a confidant. And there came a point when Robert shared something quite disturbing with him. Robert was beginning to think that his wife Nancy was slipping him something that was making him feel very strange and excessively out of it and very, very sleepy. And dreamers, we will go ahead and stop here, and I will get this part 1 published. I'm going to get to part 2 right away. I don't want to make you wait, and I don't want to wait either because this story is getting juicy. And full disclosure, like I told you, I think at the beginning, I'm familiar with the story, but all the details, all this minutia, all this background stuff is all new to me, and I'm learning this stuff right along with you, and it's kind of fun. I recently listened to a podcast on this case, and while I love listening to these stories, I felt a little shortchanged because there was so much going on in this case, and I really want to bring you every single little tidbit that I can, and I didn't really get that from the episode that I listened to. Because dreamers, I am with you on this for real. I am so invested in this story. So let me get this recorded. I'm going to get it published, and I will get cracking on part 2 immediately. Thank you, as always, so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. I'm trying to get my ass back on track here with you. Let's get through this case. Part 2 will be out in the next several days. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Did I say that already? Well, I'll say it again. I'm your host, Roseanne. And until next time, sweet dreams.